Welcome to today's meeting of the Planning and Regeneration Committee. Members of the public may like to follow at London Assembly on Twitter and use the hashtag #AssemblyPlanning for this meeting. Please may I remind you to turn your devices off or put them on silent. I really need to say that to myself because I'm sometimes the worst transgressor in that respect. So on the agenda today is a discussion on community involvement in the mayoral planning applications. However, we do have some short items of business first. Can I now ask our clerk, Diane Richards, to confirm any apologies for today's meeting?
Thank you, Chair. We have no apologies for absence for today's meeting.
Thank you. On item 2, declarations of interest, can we note the list of offices held by Assembly members, and do members have any disclosable pecuniary interests in any specific items listed on this agenda? Great. Can we confirm the minutes of the committee meeting on the 9th of November 2021? Thank you. And can we note the completed outstanding actions arising from previous meetings of the committee? Thank you. That brings us to our main item of business, our second session on the effectiveness of community involvement during the mayoral call-in process. In November, we heard from community organisations about their experiences of the mayoral call-in process and their perspectives on how the process could be improved. Today is our chance to discuss the issues that were raised by these groups with the Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills. And I'd now like to welcome our guests, Jules Pipes, EBE, who's the Deputy Mayor for Planning, Regeneration and Skills, Lucinda Turner, who's the Assistant Director of Planning in the GLA, and Peter Kemp, who's the Head of Change and Delivery at the GLA. I'm going to launch with the first question, and other members will come in as they see fit. Earlier this month, the committee met with GLA planning team to discuss proposals to improve public engagement, including the publication of the GLA's core principles. Can you briefly provide us with an update on this work and how it will impact the call-in process? Who would like to take that? Mr. Kemp. Just press the button in front of you. That's it.
Perfect. So we have the draft, which is just doing the rounds internally to make sure that our colleagues are comfortable with it already. As soon as it's kind of run through our legal colleagues and everybody, we will be making it available for other people to look at. So it should be with you within a matter of weeks now.
Are you willing to give us any spoilers?
Shall I? It will have a number of focuses. I mean, one will be clearly on where the mayor is the local planning authority, where we have more scope to influence things than kind of more widely where the boroughs are the local planning authorities. So we have been looking at some of the issues that have been raised with the committee in terms of transparency of information, navigability of the website, availability of information, etc. So we will be making a number of recommendations there, including, for example, proactively notifying people who have made representations when the mayor calls in an application. So we will do that shortly after the decision so that people know when the mayor is taking over an application, it's becoming a stage 3. So those are some of the things we've been looking at in response to some of the issues that have been raised.
Well, I'm certainly pleased to hear that, because that was one of the things that came from our investigation, the notification of residents and people who had an interest in the application in advance. Our analysis shows that out of 40 called-in applications that have been determined since 2008, all except 2 have been approved by the relevant mayor. In your view, what does this say about the call-in process? Perhaps to the deputy mayor.
I think there's always going to be a bias in the statistics towards approvals, in the same way that there are in applications considered by committee in local planning authorities. Work will have been done between planning officials and the applicant to try and make an application as policy compliant as possible. So by the time it gets to a committee stage, a lot of work will have been done to make it policy compliant and able to be approved. The possibility for approval and policy compliance is heightened further still by the time you get to a referable application that's then being called in. Officials wouldn't, or I would imagine would be reluctant to propose a potential an application for potential call-in if it seemed to them that there was no chance of it being made policy compliant. So it's somewhat inevitable that such schemes would be more likely to successfully navigate the process than not. I mean, they would be wasting everybody's time and an applicant's money if something was taken over to sort of explore the possibility of making it possibly, policy compliant, if actually in the judgment of all concerned that there was no way it would. So if it got turned down by a borough and officials here at the GLA agreed with the borough that yes, it was rightly turned down, obviously that's never going to get anywhere near being called in.
Thank you. Ms. Turner.
Just another couple of thoughts on that. Those numbers do also mask the number of directions to refuse that the mayor has made, which is about 10% of kind of the application. So there have been 11 directions to refuse. That also builds on top of, the 10% referred to those applications that come to the mayor at stage 2 with the recommendation from the boroughs to refuse, which are kind of he has allowed. So there's quite a lot there. There are also further applications that at stage 1, the mayor says he doesn't need to see again if the borough decision is to refuse. So those aren't in figures that are captured there. As well as, I think, I don't know the number, but we know that many applications will have been withdrawn from the planning process as a result of kind of critical feedback, kind of etc. So I think, yes, when you get to call in, but looking at it in the round, the mayor is also kind of active where appropriate on refusals.
Thank you. Can I just ask us to move the microphones a little closer? So sorry, it's we can hear you, but it's a bit straining. Can I ask Assembly Member Sheikh to come in now?
Yep, thank you, Chair. I was going to segue us into sort of going into a little bit more detail about what we heard from the community groups that we had come speak to us in November, and I think we all found it really constructive to kind of get some feedback from them.
Can I just ask you, Assembly Member Sheikh, Assembly Member Berry indicated on this, so before you segue, if you can allow Assembly Member Berry to come in.
I am sort of still dealing with question 1 and 2, if that's helpful. So yeah, I'll just carry on if that's all right.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, thank you. So that's what we're hoping to segue into. But I think it'd be helpful maybe to hear from you in terms of what you have deemed effective community engagement from the GLA, how you aspire to improve that. For instance, one of the things that we've spoken about in the past is a statement of community involvement from the mayor. And I know that you sort of said that you had warm feelings, to paraphrase Jules, about it, maybe not calling it that as such. But yeah, could you elaborate a little bit more on effective means of community engagement and where the areas are for improvement?
Well, that's kind of quite a broad question because I couldn't kick off by about positive areas of engagement by citing our approach to OAPFs and the very involved consultation and engagement strategy that is used for the few of those that we have done, and we intend to continue using that those methodologies going forward. The areas that we'd like to improve, though, I mean, that's quite an extensive list, and probably Peter's probably best to take you through that, because I think he's probably got it in front of him.
The areas we'd really like to improve, first of all, is we've got to carry on with the work we're doing at the moment around OPFs. We can't stop our work at the moment before we go on to what I want to talk about next. So let's talk about things that we've done with the OAP. So just the great example is probably the works we've spent a lot of time investing in the Royal Docks. We carried out both a statutory consultation, but also spent a lot more time on the ground with community groups. The really good example was spending Saturday morning in Sainsbury's, trying to actually capture people as we came through. But it is a learning journey for us. It's really, really difficult to define that we've done a fantastic job in this space. We've done quite a lot better than we used to, but that's not good enough. We want to learn a lot more about who's engaging with the planning system and who's not actually engaging with the planning system and why that's the case. It's really, really notable, all of the groups that you did a wonderful job of engaging with at your last session, all focused around individual developments initially and then kind of broadened out their interest. But what was notable is there's a number of community groups that are now pro-development as well, but there's also a lot of community groups that have never even thought about development, let alone those people who lack the community empowerment to be involved in the planning process. So we want to really start to learn a bit more about who's not at the table talking, as well as who's at the table talking. But in terms of those people who are at the table talking to us, we also need to learn to get better to listen. So in the Royal Docks, we ran 2 types of consultations at the same time. We wrote to every household. We sent them this massive leaflet that I should have brought along, but it was this big fold-out exercise. And it explained what was really going on, because things like opportunity area planning frameworks don't make sense to you if you don't work in the development space. They're just something else that someone's producing. So we spent a lot of time trying to decode that. We ran a digital platform at the same time to enable kind of people who were interested in coming and finding more and providing comments on it. And that was commonplace, that was spoken about previously. But what was really interesting about using a digital platform was the conversion rates are extraordinarily poor. And if we want to free up capacity amongst kind of the consultation space so that we can do more and better, we need to think about those people that are really easy to access that digital space. And then there's probably the bigger piece, which is how do people engage with the built environment in general? In the nicest possible way, if you put a plan in front of my mum, she'd just look at you and smile, actually in front of my dad as well. But actually we need to think about how we visualise things. So we ran a programme through the Civic Innovation Challenge that enabled people to access and drive through 3D models. And we're looking at how we take those onto the next stream as well.
Yes, just running back to the question of, what is the fate of things that get referred to the Mayor. It would be really useful, I think, for our purposes to have something that shows the different kinds of attrition and what happens to things maybe once they reach stage 1. I'm sure you must have data on that. Things, like you said, things that are withdrawn, things that are then refused by the council and you're not going to intervene in that, things that are directed to refuse by you, all of those different fates, effectively. It'd be useful to see that in data so that we can visualise it and get a better picture of this sort of perception that we had at the beginning of the meeting, which is things are called in order to approve. So yeah, that would be really useful, I think.
Can I respond on that? Some of it will be easier than others, where they disappear kind of from the planning process and are withdrawn. We may not have absolute visibility of that, things on the directions to refuse, etc. But if we take that away and look at what data we
That's why I said at stage 1, because I think by the time you've commented at stage 1, that might be the starting point to begin with.
Yes, please, Mr. Kemp.
Sorry, could I just come in on that? We have a lot of data about things that happen inside the GLA. We have a lot of data now and are starting to get better data about what happens in the boroughs. and it's what you're actually asking is link the two together, and that's something we haven't done yet.
I strongly suspect that might be something you'd be very good at, though, Peter. So maybe you could help.
We'll see. We'll see.
Yes, please, Assembly Member Sheikh, but could I ask members, we are getting comments from outside the room that people can't be heard much. But we do need to be much closer to the mic. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Assembly Member Sheikh.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned, we sort of wanted to relay some of what we heard. I have no doubt you'd have watched the webcast anyway to the November meeting, and it was rich in detail, and I think there were some really tangible outcomes. And so one of the things we wanted to tease out was some of the community groups raised, for instance, when there is a call-in application and there are walkarounds of the site. I think in particular Stag Brewery was mentioned in this case. The developer is sometimes invited to have that walk around. And so I wanted to put to you, what would be the advantages of also allowing community groups to be involved in a walk around of a site that's currently being considered under the call-in process?
Yeah. I mean, it's important to reiterate what I've said before, that there is no opportunity for the developer to engage with the mayor, or if it's me. I mean, I'm on every one. But whether it's the mayor as the decision maker or whether I'm the decision maker, there is no discussion with the applicant. I think the committee's been apprised before about who is actually on these visits, including a legal officer who is there to vouch for the fact that nothing inappropriate occurs, such as direct contact and discussion with the applicant. The applicant is only there for if the mayor or myself has a question that is relayed to the planning officers present and the planning officers can't answer it, and then the planning officer will seek to get that answer. Invariably not from the developer, invariably they're not there actually, it will be the developer's architect, because they are the person that can actually answer the questions likely to come up on a potentially that could come up on a site visit. It's very rare that such a question does arise. Normally, it is a completely wasted journey for the applicant's representative, because the planning officer is able to answer all the mayor's or my questions. I don't think it would be an appropriate thing for the public to attend, for the same reasons that it's not appropriate for the developer to approach the mayor and discuss things. It's not a lobbying opportunity. It is a fact-finding opportunity for the decision maker to see the site. It's not a wider fact-gathering opportunity, and I think there could be real problems in trying to manage that process practically. That said, though, one thing that we have looked at is, and the team want to consider, is actually having the case officer meet with residents and have a kind of a parallel process, and so that the residents can and other interested parties can directly, in person instead of just by mail and email, can put their points across directly to the case officer.
For Jules, thank you. And I have sort of three-layered response really, which I think one thing that was quite clear from that meeting is perhaps there's a difference between process and perception. And more often than not, even if you have really clear forms of perception, like you've just, clear forms of process, like you've just outlined, for instance, it won't necessarily be the developer there, it might be a representative, it's for a very specific question that planning officer isn't able to answer, which sounds arm's length and appropriate. The perception, I suppose, for community groups is that the developers are being walked around the site and they're not. So I think that's the first point I'd say, which is I think when we look to aspire community engagement, bridging that is important. And I might drill down a little bit, and you sort of said you don't think it would be appropriate for community groups to be there, and that you might suggest instead a case officer having a parallel process. But could you, maybe because of practicalities, could you drill down into what those impracticalities are and what might be the advantages of allowing community groups to, almost have that walk around so that they feel like they are shaping the process as much as the perception that the developer is?
Sorry, what was the very last part?
Just the impracticalities that you said that
could
arise.
The very last bit.
So I think that's all I said.
Oh,
really.
right, sorry, okay. I mean, obviously, that there is a security issue, to be frank. I mean, I don't think it's something I should go into here, but I mean, clearly advertising, you know, whoever the Mayor of London is, the Mayor of London's presence, just walking around with minimal, well, no, it wouldn't be appropriate I think, to go into it in this forum, but I think there are issues about publicly advertising a mayoral visit, and it would, there's an awful lot of work and preparation that goes into publicly advertised mayoral visits, and I think it would be difficult to apply that to a site visit. I just don't think that they're, and as I say, I come back to the point that I made earlier, I don't think they are public meetings, that it doesn't lend itself, what they're seeking to achieve for the mayor isn't, that isn't part of the process.
Okay, and just the parallel case officer meeting that you said could take place, is that something that you see incoming in future call-in applications in lieu of a site visit for community groups?
Yes, I mean, I think it's something that I mean, we haven't fully thought it through yet, but I think it's certainly a possibility.
That sounds promising.
And just to add to that, yeah, it's definitely something we're considering, and it has happened kind of on various applications as well, kind of less formally.
Sort of an ad hoc.
Yeah, more
but
an ad.
just formalising it and making it a standard part of the process, that people are offered that opportunity to engage face to face.
Yeah.
But also in terms of the itinerary for the mayor's visit, etc., and which views he goes to look at, and what he sees, that is very much informed as well.
Because if it was held before the site visit, then local people could say, right, we'd like the mayor to view this from here, here, and here, for example.
Yeah, I think that kind of bridged into my exact second question, which is, I think that was another thing that was reflected by community groups, which is, I guess, the perception that GLA officers perhaps don't grant them as much of an opportunity to meet with them as they would, say, for instance, the developer, whether that's for practical reasons about specific questions to do with the application. Again, it's that bridge of perception. So I think if we did formalise the opportunity for community groups to meet with GL officers before site visits, it might be quite effective in tackling that.
And that perception is perfectly understandable. However, of course, it is the case that the engagement that happens between the GLA and the developer is not about allowing the developer an opportunity to lobby GLA planning officers of their case. It's actually the reverse that happens. It's actually GLA officers trying to shape the developer's proposal to bring it into compliance with policy, which a lot of the time, hopefully most of the time, will be in line with what local people would like to see, and one achieves that with varying degrees of success.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Just following up from that, I mean, you've confirmed that there isn't parity in the treatment of applicants and the wider public.
Parity of treatment?
Yeah, because the mere fact that you've invited along, they may be the architect, surely that's, and yet not invited along just one representative. I'm not saying you invite the entire street, but one representative along who can summarise the objections in the same way that an architect might be able to explain the particular details of that application. I don't, you see, this isn't, in the public's mind, this isn't parity.
But that isn't what the architect does. In your question just now, you put it to me that what the architect does is similar to a resident being able to summarise local people's objections. The architect doesn't come along and summarise the benefits of the proposal to the mayor.
Well, what's he there for then? What's he there for then?
As I explained, if the mayor or myself has a question, specific question, technical question that the planning officer is unable to answer, then the planning officer themselves will ask the architect the question, and then through the planning officer, the answer will be given to the mayor. It just simply isn't a lobbying opportunity for the.
I wasn't
Yeah.
saying it was a lobbying
but
opportunity.
in your suggested question,
yeah.
when you say about a resident summarising the objections to the mayor or decision maker, the equivalent for the applicant would be for the architect or for the planning representative to extol the benefits of the scheme to the mayor. Well, that isn't allowed. So, as I'm saying, I'm not trying to claim there is parity, because at the moment there is no representative, and that's why I'm suggesting that, and we're suggesting, the team's suggesting that allow the opportunity for residents to engage directly face-to-face with the planning officer in the same way that the applicant engages directly with the planning officer. They don't engage directly with the mayor or decision maker.
Okay. You haven't persuaded me that it's parity, but Assembly Member Baker. Oh, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. Question 5. No, that's all right. That's all right.
I'm glad my mic wasn't on for my
Well,
immense confusion
Oh,
there.
Assembly Member Best, did you want to come in at this point?
Just it might get lost otherwise. Is that okay? Because I thought is this specifically on that. So I can what we established is there's definitely it's an opportunity that might be misinterpreted and and we can see how that happens. So is there a way in which to make the procedure more formal in terms of an applicant? Of course, they might have to be there because logistically they might have to open that site, for example. But maybe they wait outside. If you're saying there's only very rare occasions where you would ask a question through the planning officer, I don't see that would have to be done on the day. So perhaps it could be quite a formalised process that an applicant isn't invited on the site visit. They're merely there to, if necessary, to open up a site, but they aren't there with you.
That is a very good point and a very valid point, I think, and we are actively actually considering that. That the few times that the applicants, and as I say, it's usually the applicant's representative or their architect rather than the developer themselves, and the very few times that they have ever been asked a question, I think we probably could hold site visits without them being there, and simply if there is a question that the planning officer can't resolve at the time, it's done through email and whatever, and through another process. And if it made people feel that was that really was necessary to ensure greater confidence that there is parity of treatment, then I think that we should be seriously looking at that.
Thank you. Assembly Member Baker.
Thank you. Well, we've touched upon a couple of particular circumstances where community groups who often felt like they had a perception that they weren't necessarily getting enough engagement with the process, and that led to a perception from a number of them in the previous session that effectively the GLA planning process was remote and it was sort of unapproachable. So, in generally, apart from the measures that you've talked about already, is there other measures that you might consider to help with that perception and tackle that?
Well, I think there's lots of things that, or a number of things that we can do to improve the current process. I mean, we've moved to a new platform for information for people, but it still needs improvement. It passed accessibility tests, but that still doesn't mean to say that it's just easy for people to navigate, and we need to sort that out. The documents being hard to find, again, it's practical things like that we can address. URLs, and just simply what the documents are called, for example, and being more interventionist about that, in tidying things up to make it easier for the public. I know that people complain that documents are hard to understand. I mean, that is tricky. I mean, they are constructed by professionals for lay people, but nevertheless lay people who have been trained and, by virtue of a period of time, versed in the language and technicalities that they're having to consider in an application. So there are probably always going to be limits to that. I would say in the GLA's defence that I don't think these processes are worse than, if this is any kind of defence, any worse than standard local government procedures and processes for any service. And I say that with 20 years experience in local and regional government, that unfortunately it is always a challenge to make things relevant and accessible for people in all services that people are seeking to engage in. And especially when this one, which a significant part of it isn't public facing, despite the fact that all public services by definition are to be for the benefit of the public. A lot of this obviously is aimed at technicians and professionals in the built environment sector. But that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't try.
My second question is around the actual planning approval process. Now, obviously, who makes the decision is set out in legislation, but interested to know what you think about the process and whether, in theory, it could be improved. Should the final decision on planning approval could it be made by a wider group of people rather than just the mayor? And could groups be given greater opportunities to input into that process?
Well, that is another kind of broad question that touches on a number of points in the process, and so probably the answer could be different to different parts of it. I mean, it'd probably be useful at some point for the committee to consider, the differences between stage 2 and stage 3 process. I mean, the stage 3 does have an awful lot of parallels, I would think, with a local authority planning process, and one could discuss about the appropriateness of a single person in that situation. The stage 2s, I think, is completely different. Stage 2s are, the legislation provides for a 2-week period for quite a high-level strategic overview of the decision made by the local planning authority. Does it fit with their own policies and the whole suite of policies in the round, so both their local policies and regional London plan policy? I think it would be odd to have that done by a committee, because it effectively you'd be rerunning the planning process on every major application, and I don't think that's necessarily appropriate or proportionate. The stage 3 process, I mean, I haven't given this any thought, so I'd have to go away and think about a response to that. I mean, just simply because it is what it is. It's the legislation that it's a consequence of this being a mayoral authority and not a committee system. So I think I haven't given it any thought, because there'd be no point in thinking about it in isolation. One would have to think about it in terms of the whole GLA approach about being a mayoral versus a committee system authority.
No, I think that's reasonable. Although I'm surprised you haven't thought about at some point, a bit of a daydream about alternative planning structures. But I suppose it's also helpful for people, community groups who are engaging with it, to understand the differences and to understand that yes, this is different for a particular reason. Well, it just is. And the sort of lack of discussion of alternatives or awareness of alternatives sometimes maybe just doesn't help that.
Yeah. I mean, if it softens it at all, I think that when you look at that it softens the need for changing or the current system is inappropriate. I mean, it's not as if these applications have only been considered in their journey by one single person, but they will have been also considered by the local authority, and a lot of consultation at that point, and views aired, and we shouldn't forget that an awful lot of these applications, just in case this doesn't come in at another point, have actually been recommended for approval by officers at the local planning authority. And that's not to negate the view of the planning committee. They're absolutely local democracy. They're perfectly entitled to come to the decision that they have made at committee. But the stage 2 decisions the stage 3 decisions shouldn't be viewed, I think, in the context of it's only been looked at by the GLA and then decided by one person. There will have been quite an involved process before that. Sure.
And just to expand on one point, obviously you've said that you're not really envisaged in a totally different system, but in the system we have, do you think there is a further role that the London Assembly could play in that process?
I don't think it's for me to suggest. I would happily, and the Mayor, I'm sure, would happily consider any suggestions.
Okay, thank you.
It's for the committee to recommend.
Thank you. Assembly Member Best.
Thanks very much. It seemed like you weren't entirely ruling out the idea of committee decisions around planning if we could legislatively, constitutionally make that work.
Well, I think that's for the government. It's a government decision about.
But interesting, I think perhaps that you yourself weren't necessarily ruling that out.
I wasn't really commenting, I think. Because it's
Not
not something.
commenting, not
It's
ruling out,
not something I'm competent to promote or to negate. It's a matter for central government and the legislative framework that they have set up for the GLA.
Yeah. Oh, I just wanted to kind of clarify on that, because I think the very fact, and I know you're saying no comment, I think that to me suggests perhaps there is some openness on your side. Maybe I suggest, because looking at the
Neutrality,
the feedback we've got, you know, and clearly the decision coming to one person. That there's comments here, you know, in the pack about perceiving the Mayor as the most remote and opaque of those in powers, working against our interests. And I think that comes from not having a committee decision. It's very easy to have.
No, I disagree, because I think exactly the same criticisms are made about the committee system at local government level and all the way up through regional government to national government.
You know, I'd politely come back and disagree, because when you have a committee hearing, you do get different voices, and I've never heard the same accusations about the GLA planning system levelled at local councils. You did say earlier they're much the same, but I haven't heard it to the same level, because the committee system does allow more of a conversation. Obviously, when there's one person making the decision, that conversation just can't happen.
No,
unless the Mayor's going to turn around and start speaking to himself, and you know, in questions, which I don't imagine he does.
Perhaps having been elected Mayor for 16 years, I'm biased, but no, I don't think that's true. I think that all the same criticisms. You know, at Hackney for 16 years, I was not responsible for planning decisions, but the same criticisms are levelled at the planning committee. You know, even though they were a committee and it was in a mayoral authority. Similarly, in committee system authorities, I think all these criticisms are levelled at local government, and always have been. I promised my team I was not going to raise this, but you know, if you go back to the first episode of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in the 1970s, the gag was that the planning application was advertised in the bottom of a locked filing cabinet behind the door marked "Beware of the Leopard." You know, these gags were being made in the 1970s, and you know, it's consistently levelled at local and regional and national government, that it's remote, unaccountable, and it's not listening to local people, and there's a lack of opportunities for people to engage. And I don't think these criticisms are unique to the GLA or the GLA's planning system.
Thanks, Jules. We've got local councillors here, so hopefully there'll be more advice on that.
Perhaps those three authorities have never received any criticism of their processes and their planning decisions. I don't know whether that's the case.
What I don't want you to misunderstand is there's a level of contempt for local planning decisions, and then there's contempt for the GLA, and it is far beyond that of the local planning systems. And I've worked in several boroughs on these and with several resident groups on several applications. And so I'm saying there is contempt for both, but it far outweighs the GLA. Far outweighs anything that I've seen levelled at local planning committees.
But I think you would have to compare like with like. So if you took all the large applications that come to boroughs and the concern in the local community that they raise, I think that would be comparable to the same that we get, because what we're talking about here are the stage 3 applications. We're talking about 20-odd applications, which are the largest and most controversial in London. I think one should compare the concern in the community that those raise to the concern raised by those same applications in the borough or other non-referable applications, but that may be approaching the same kind of size. I think that would be
We'll just
fair.
agree to disagree, and I think that's best left.
Thank you. I think I made that joke when I was a Hackney councillor about hitchhikers. Anyway, Assembly Member Berry.
Thank you very much. I've got a bit of a follow-up and then I'll go on to my section. Is that okay, Chair?
Yes, please.
Yeah,
yes.
great. Okay. So yeah, at least you're not approved any bypasses that I'm aware of since you were taking over. I wonder if I can ask the sort of same question in a different way that might unlock you a little bit, because you probably do think about this. Are you aware of any other models elsewhere under different legislation and in different countries of regional metro level planning that has a different system that we might look at and consider whether we might like aspects of?
No, I'm afraid my knowledge is limited of other systems around the world in terms of decision making. I mean, obviously, a lot of the approaches used in, well, the two main approaches in this country, whether it's mayoral or whether it's committee system, are obviously replicated many times around the world. Things I've looked at more than the actual decision-making process is the sort of the plan-making process around the world, which is different. Often it's proposed as being better, but then it's looked at and people decide it's not, and then governments walk back from it. And we've seen that recently again with yet again another consideration of zoning. And they decided not to go in that direction. The only other departure from mayoral and wide area planning committees that I've had experience of is neighbourhood planning committees, and that's often fraught with difficulty.
But they don't make decisions, so...
Oh, well, yeah, no, unfortunately, there was the ones that I had experience of did, and that becomes deeply problematic. There are also, actually, some boroughs do have a hybrid system where they do have smaller committees taking smaller decisions and extensions and the like, and a strategic committee considering that involves members of the executive sometimes, that takes decisions on larger applications. But that's kind of, I think that's the only variation. Those are the only two variations that I'm aware of in this country from mayoral and general committee.
Okay, yeah, I mean, obviously there's the United States as well, where everything's different, including zonal planning, but also where things like, for example, their justice system, where you're making really actual judicial type decisions about prosecutions, there's political consequences for the policies people take there, which is very, very different and much more devolution. Probably digressing at this point, though.
I
we may want to look around the world for different models that we're interested in.
The problem, one of the problems we do have in this country, though, is you know, we're very poor as a country about teaching civics and how people engage with authorities and local authorities in the country, and it's something that I think you should know by the time you leave school. You should certainly know more than kids currently do when they leave school. And that has left us in a situation where I think the majority of people, maybe not the ones that have engaged actively in local planning decisions, they learn pretty quickly, but the mass of people that haven't engaged presume planning decisions are taken by people elected on their behalf, taking the decision on their behalf about what local people might want. And then they are shocked that when they take a decision that's controversial, as opposed to taking a decision in a quasi-judicial way, does it measure up to local, regional and national planning policy, which is a completely different task. So that does raise the question about whether planning decisions, and has in the past raised a question whether planning decisions ought to be taken by local councillors rather than a body specifically appointed to take these decisions, simply because they're not representative decisions. They're decisions taken, as I said, about does this match up to planning policy.
These are different approaches. I should move on, shouldn't I?
Well, just to remind members, we're having so much fun, we're going a little over time on the sections. So if you find one of your set questions has already been answered, please skip it or do what you can. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So moving on to a topic which we discussed yesterday in our plenary meeting, and I'm certain you'll be asked to help respond to the motion that we passed, which is around. I mean, the proposal that was passed aims to address, in some ways, the fact that many of the groups we spoke to talked to us about resources. They felt there wasn't a level playing field in terms of resources, technical expertise, know-how, like you say, about the process, the networks, who knows who and who can talk to who. There's a lot of sense of being shut out there, partly because of a lack of ability to just, get the advice they need that costs money. I mean, I work on lots of things around London, and the amount of times I've been around the house of somebody who's decided to get involved with something like the schemes we were discussing, and they've had to teach themselves from scratch about the planning system and the law and the ways that things are assessed, and their houses are full of paper, and and this is amazing that they do this, but also it'd be amazing if they could hire someone to give them that advice in the way that you do. So have you thought about this and what steps the GLA can take to ensure that people without resources, and particularly communities without resources, who are the ones affected by a lot of the major applications given the locations that we tend to be developing on, to address that lack of expertise, that ability to just hire the advice you need when you need it?
I mean, well, there is a lack of resources across the planning system in this country, and at the end of the day, it should be at the local authority level that these resources are deployed, but there is, not for a second would I suggest that local authorities currently have those resources to be able to deploy. So, I mean, by the time...
I mean, we would like to fix it across the board, but we're focused on major applications that the Mayor calls in, so we're thinking about resources in respect of those more than the whole system, if it helps to focus the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly, as I've said, that we've talked about some things that we can do to make the process more accessible and understandable. There is probably more pre-prepared documents that we could produce that educate people on the process, and we would certainly want to do that as part of the programme that Peter's overseeing. I think, though, where we just simply wouldn't be able to help is effectively provide, officer, similar resources, officers in person to guide groups through the process, and not least that sometimes, more often than not, there is perhaps a counter proposal for a development, and it's not within the planning system to develop counter proposals to put to a developer. The system is there to judge the proposals that the applicant is making, and the decision maker or makers have to judge the proposal that's before them. And the engagement that the process has with objectors should be used to help the officials interrogate the proposal and that it meets policy. And that's really as far as that can go. I don't think it's practical, or I can't see it ever being affordable to provide advocates for objectors. And also, not all objectors agree on what they want to see, and so that's why the process is that the officials collate all the views, see where those views align with policy requirements that can be legitimately made of the applicant, and put those to the applicant, and that's where all those meetings come in with the applicant that people are concerned about, to try and achieve the desired policy outcomes as adopted.
I mean, there's clearly a need for this because there are out there charities, there are community groups who help provide advice, who are staffed by partly staff, partly volunteers. There's a very small number of grant-giving organisations who sometimes we can signpost people to get help when they're dealing with public inquiries and examinations in public, and all of those things, and your mayoral applications as well. But so there's clearly a need for it, but there's nowhere near enough resource, and there's very little consistency in what people are able to get either. And I just can't see why this isn't something which could have some resource assigned to it. As you just said, elected councillors have one role when they're sitting on the council, they have another role when we're sitting on the planning committee. Potentially officers within your team could have a more neutral role, one that's facilitating in terms of helping turn resident complaints into valid planning objections, because often they do have valid planning objections. They may not be expressing that in exactly the right way, and that's one of the things that potentially independent or semi-independent officers within your team could be assigned to help with.
I think, well, as I say, I mean, there's an issue of resources that I would say makes it impractical. Also, I think in a point of principle that it does open up the question about whether it's actually an inquisitorial or an adversarial process. I think it's really meant to be inquisitorial, and the independent planning body is just simply trying to apply adopted policy. Obviously, it does get overlaid with this adversarial approach where you can have applicant versus objectors. And that gets us to what we're discussing now, where the applicants are well funded and the inquisitorial approach is underfunded, and the objectors have no funding.
Yeah, and I think there's something needs to be done to level the playing field in there.
But I'm not sure whether the correct thing is to start funding, accept that it's completely adversarial, and then also the inquisitorial centre then funding the one of the adversarial sides. Peter?
Sorry, can I just add to that? Because there's conceptually, there's potentially a problem here that Jules was just kind of skimming the edge of, which is actually in the planning system, the power isn't at the point that you're arguing about a planning application. And one of the big
we do have further questions on earlier stages.
And our biggest challenge is is the best way to involve communities in how we develop policy.
Completely.
And engage them more effectively in what that really means. Yeah. And that's an impossible question. And kind of going back to the boroughs issue as well, I'm yet to see anyone that's really achieved this properly.
Yeah, no, I agree, and we will have more questions about getting people involved at the earlier stages, but it's making people feel like they've had a fair shot at putting their case when there is a decision being made that we're trying to get onto here. So in terms of, it's really interesting you talk about inquisitorial versus adversarial, because obviously the old sort of public inquiry system has registered objectors, that's literally what they're called. And the system of examinations in public, which are done for DCOs now and local plans, are intended to be a bit more accessible and inquisitorial, and the examiners there will often sit down with the objectors and talk to them in their own terms and interpret for themselves, do that, make that effort to turn it into valid language. And I think there is something to be said for the planning authority making an effort in that way. The other thing that resident...
I do think that on that that would also apply at local level as well, and I think that then starts opening up the question about sort of the professionalisation of decision makers at a local level, because obviously in an inquiry setting, it's a full-time role, and it goes back to this question of are local authorities the right place to make planning decisions. I'm not questioning whether they are or aren't, really. It's kind of a theoretical thing that flows from the question about, is it fit for purpose currently in the way we approach planning in this country?
Yeah. Okay, so my next question is about access to information, because your planning website is very sparse. And we complain about there being far too many documents on local borough planning applications. There's virtually nothing ever appears on your website. We get to see the reports and the decision letters. There's an opportunity to add comments there, but nobody ever sees the comments that are listed in contrast to what happens in boroughs. And we know that some groups have had to use freedom of information requests to just get basic information about the process, and to know, what stage things are at and who to contact. And is there more you can do there to make it the information that's available on the website alongside the application?
Yes, absolutely. And it was going back to something I said earlier. We're committing to do more, get more onto the website. There is a bit of a question mark though about all the consultation responses though, because apparently a lot of boroughs don't. That we've seen, and it's a bit of potentially the legal issues that flow from that. So that's why we don't, and that's also, I believe, why a lot of boroughs don't.
Can we find more information about that? Because in my experience, most boroughs seem to publish redacted responses.
It certainly is patchy. Some do, some don't, because I've had a long look.
And the legal implications of being the publisher of a document, that you then carry the full liability, or at least that's what I was always advised in a borough. You carry the liability of defamation.
Completely, but that doesn't seem like justification for a blanket.
When you're dealing
redaction
with upward of 30,000 a year, it was certainly a cost implication to us in a borough when I was there.
So it's cost again. Okay, we can note more money is needed throughout the entire thing.
Could I just come in on the point? I think kind of more generally the point on improving navigability of the site, increasing the kind of access to the information and kind of understanding of the process. And I think it went back to a point earlier. The process is really complicated. There are different rules if it's a residential scheme around call-ins versus if it's a kind of a commercial scheme, etc. I mean, it is. So we are looking absolutely and will commit to kind of trying to put together some information to make it more understandable for people, to improve the kind of the website, the URLs have been talked about, the naming of documents, etc. So we are actively looking at that, and hopefully you will see some improvements on that.
Excellent. As an active user of the site myself, the document names are right. Yeah. So, I mean, the other thing that's come up is that community groups are brought in like too late into the process during stage 2, which can be quite a short period. They've got a very small window to engage with your officers, and again, it's very hard for them to find the case officer. They're not listed. Is there more you can do to reach out earlier to the community groups who are, or the objectors to schemes in which you're getting involved, to bring them in, because that can feel a bit tense, that whole short deadline after stage 2.
Yeah, well, at stage 2, there's very little we can do about that. We do want to start publishing the lists of upcoming stage 2s, but we only get 14 days from the moment they send it in, and there's no requirement for them to tell us when they're going to send it in. It's purely just a friendly arrangement that they'll keep us updated about how it's progressing, and sometimes you can get a committee decision and then it could be a year before they forward it if there's a long section 106 argument that ensues, and then they could suddenly tie up the 106 and send it through to us without any notice, and then the clock starts ticking and we've got 14 days. And
you can imagine how that feels to somebody who's in the community. They've spent that effort, it's been through the council, and now they're waiting.
We can, as I say, we can publish the list as soon as we're aware of what we've got. We can encourage boroughs, can't require them, but we can encourage boroughs to keep us informed about the likely date. And if there was consistent information about that, it may be then worth publishing as to the likely date it was expected. But until we had a pretty uniform approach by boroughs, I don't think that would be a very useful way forward in doing it on an ad hoc basis. On stage 3s, though, very different. As I've said, we are, we want to tell people as soon as we've taken something over, and then we'll tell them again at the beginning of formal consultation.
Okay, that is helpful. We've talked about the website. I think I'm probably...
Yeah, I was just going to suggest 9 and 10 have largely been answered, perhaps, but it's up to you.
Yes, no, they have. You're right,
Yep.
completely. Because the point that Peter made earlier on about the efforts in Royal Docks to go and do more in-person engagement, I think was something that answers the question about people who can't engage digitally. And I think that's really important. The other thing, if I just mention one more thing, is the DCO process now allows for essentially open mic sessions that are part of the process. So it means that the inspector running the examination goes down to the local area and hires a hall and says, anyone who wants to can come along and tell me their views. And that obviously results in people coming along and saying things that are not of relevance to the particular questions they may have asked. It's not, they've published their questions that they want to have answered, and people come and bring up other things. But it nevertheless, I think, is really educational for the examiner, the person to go and listen to the people affected by this thing and get a sense of it, and to hear which of the planning questions have the most sort of feeling behind them and community evidence.
Perhaps that's something that's of most relevance for us with the London Planning for London programme, and we are looking really quite broadly as to how we engage on that, because we do want to reach representatives from every community in London and genuinely hear diverse views. So that's something we can take away. I mean, we're looking at using digital platforms, as we say, but we're looking to engage with youth panels. We're looking at the use of urban rooms across different places to get into communities. I mean, it's certainly something we can take away, but I think it's probably that kind of programme where it might be best suited for our work.
Assembly Member Baker.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask a really brief follow-up on the question before about information on when applications might land with you from boroughs. I appreciate, the desire to have complete information, but unless you are allowed to do it, unless you're allowed to require it, then you're never going to get it. So do you not think it might be better to publish what you have, and it might maybe nudge boroughs that aren't giving you the information to do that? And it would certainly cut down some of the people who are wondering when on earth that application is going to land with the Mayor's office.
So to be clear, I was saying that we would publish ones we'd received. Yeah, so as soon as we get them, they would go on the list and say, so the 14 days has started ticking.
Of course, no, absolutely. I know that's that, but you were talking about maybe if you had information and there was dialogue with the borough saying, actually, this is going to go, it's not in the post, is it anymore?
I'm going to defer to Lucinda and Peter here, because this is a practical issue about databases and...
Yeah.
It would be hugely difficult, because you also get a lot of false starts. I mean, we'd probably end up causing as much aggravation the other way, to be honest, because we're often primed and then it can disappear for 3 months. And I actually think it would be potentially have as many downsides.
And then when it did arrive, it not being complete. So as far as we're concerned, the clock hasn't actually started ticking.
Or we've seen us have cried wolf, and you told us 4 times now it's going to be here. You finally have. We didn't trust it and we missed it. So
no, I understand. Thanks.
Can I just add to that as well?
Yes, please.
You assume that every authority across London wants to work collectively in the same direction. So we do actually receive them during periods of holidays as well. So we received one between Christmas and New Year, just as an example. So that 14 days in theory kicks in. So it's really difficult to manage.
Can you publish your work programme?
We've published the London Plan Work Programme where we have more control over it, and the LPG etc. We can look at what we can do, but I just think where we just have no control over it, and it is so changeable, that would be difficult. But as Jules said, we will certainly look to where we do have them in, and all the information is correct. Because that's the other thing, sometimes you get partial things in without all the information that's required. So we will look at doing what we that's helpful.
Although what does go a long way to that is the status of each one, whether they've been through their stage one. That's publicly available information. So but there isn't much more one can say until one definitely knows the stage two is on its way. I suppose an indicator is, for what it's worth, is that the committee has heard it locally, but that could mean nothing if it takes a year to agree the Section 106. So,
thank you. Assembly Member Best, please.
Thank you. Hopefully a quick one. Would you consider publishing a formal statement of community involvement? Many local authorities have done that now.
Yeah. We're looking at doing something that kind of fulfills the spirit of that, but it wouldn't be called a statement of community involvement because it's different legislation and would mislead some people into quite what status that such a document would have. So we can meet the spirit of it, but it wouldn't actually be an SCI. Peter is probably better positioned to explain the legislation than me.
Have you got all day?
No, we haven't.
But in short, that's essentially what we're trying to do with our core principles. Is covers the same ground, and it would mean that certainly for customers of this as a planning authority would have it clearly set out what they can and can't expect in the planning process, and also be really, really clear as to how far we can go as an authority. Just to kind of try and get that down in black and white. And then at the end of our review process that we're just starting at the moment, so discovery, to revisit that and kind of set out perhaps some vastly improved arrangements.
Thank you. So just can I quickly confirm that the spirit document looks like a core principles with do's and don'ts, basically, and what to expect, which pretty much ticks most of the boxes of a statement of community involvement, just without the legal kind of framework around that. Yeah?
Correct.
Thanks.
We speak, but yeah.
I think that's confirmed. Assembly Member Shade to ask the next question.
Great. So we're moving on to the section, I think, around call-ins, sort of maybe not reform as such, but I think one thing again that came from the meeting we had in November that we found really interesting is developing this idea of what would community groups want from a call-in system that allowed them to feel more involved and engaged in how applications were called in and what happened once they were. So I'd start off with the kind of specific question of, do you think local communities should be and could be given a greater role in deciding whether applications could be called in?
Not in the way that the legislation is currently drawn. It's quite tight within the Mayor of London Act and the Order 2008, the basis on which things are called in.
I suppose if you were to change the legislation, what would that look like?
I'm afraid I
haven't given it
contemplated ways in which I would want to change.
And if we didn't change the legislation, do you think that there could be some space for flexibility? So would you, for instance, I'm literally plucking this off the top of my head, but have a kind of informal steering group of local residents that might, not so much as a formalised meeting with a case officer in the way that we described at the beginning, but they might, if an application was rejected or passed locally, they might want to say, actually, we think that this could be called in, and it doesn't fit within the current criteria. Let me actually help by anchoring this with a specific example. So, for instance, the Truman Brewery in Tower Hamlets, it was faced a lot of opposition on the grounds that it would gentrify the area. I think there were 7,000 letters written in the end in terms of objections. It was passed, but a lot of the people raised concerns about the fact that it would gentrify the area, it would price out local businesses, and I'm sure you're already aware that they're currently raising legal funds to challenge it and have been granted, or at least their legal representation have said that they feel like there is grounds for challenging. So I guess in that instance, they are beginning to shape the answer to this question, which is they want to have a bigger say as a community on whether an application is called in. They haven't been able to do that, so they're taking it into their own hands. So in lieu of that, not in lieu of that, but like what other ways can we imagine that communities might be able to be more involved in whether an application is called in, like, for instance, they are already modelling in this situation?
I'm struggling to kind of think of something that meshes with the basis on which the mayor takes things over. I mean, your example, the Truman Brewery, it didn't meet the criteria of the Mayor of London order, so he didn't have the right to intervene and take it over, even if he was minded to.
It's very clear about the kind of criteria for the types of categories of applications that can be called in, and kind of, for example, even those referable applications that are on Greenbelt or Metropolitan Open Land aren't actually eligible for call-in by the mayor under the Act. So it is, I mean, if the mayor tried, I am absolutely sure he would be challenged by people. He would have no locus to do so. So it's quite difficult to understand. And then the basis, the kind of tests are also stipulated, and one of the ones is sound planning reasons.
Yes.
So it can't just, it has to be related to planning grounds,
Of course.
not just opposition or people's desire to see it.
Of course. And so I guess that leads me on to a question that I wanted to ask is, do you think, for instance, if we were having let's take our legal hat off for a moment and say, could you foresee a situation where ascertaining the future harms of gentrification could be a criteria for call-in?
How would someone do that?
I have taken my legal hat off, so I won't be able to answer how they would do that. But I suppose in this instance, what community groups felt, or people in the local area, and we heard Saif Osmani, who was a very articulate individual who was doing a lot of that campaigning alongside a bigger coalition of people, feel that, for instance, although this particular application didn't fall in the call-in criteria because it provided appropriate affordable housing, it was London Plan compliant, that actually in the future that this development would lead to local businesses being priced out, an area in East London that has been heavily gentrified. It's a term that hasn't quite made its way into the institutional language in terms of how we assess the effects on local people, but is an accepted and understood term in London. I suppose that kind of analysis, and I think Runnymede and Class have done a really excellent report on metrics of gentrification. So I think perhaps going away and having a look at what those metrics look like and how we can ascertain future harms of it, could that be integrated in a call-in criteria for the future?
I don't think it can without it being used within and informing the whole planning process. I don't think you can do it in isolation for the stage threes, and I'm not sure why it would only apply to stage threes. Why wouldn't it apply to all applications? So I think it would have to, this is actually a question that it would be better posed to the whole planning system of this country, because it goes to what is permissible to have in planning policy and what is permissible to refuse things or revise things against. So it wouldn't just be stage threes. And just on Truman's again, it wasn't not referable because it was compliant with London Plan policy. It was not big enough. I mean, it was the height, the amount of square footage of commercial space, number of housing units, of which I think there were none or very low. It simply didn't meet the size requirements to be strategic, sufficiently strategic to allow the mayor to call it in, even if he'd been lobbied to by local people and wanted to take a look at it. He wouldn't have, the legislation wouldn't have allowed him to, not because of policy compliance, but more just because size compliance with the requirements.
Yeah, so we kind of end up doing a full circle, really, which it comes back to the criteria for call-in, which is it didn't fit the criteria for call-in in this instance.
And perhaps to go back to your earlier question about local people deciding, I mean, I think then that would be open to everyone who didn't agree with the outcome of a local decision could ask the mayor to have a look at it again, and this would be a second chance for every single planning application that people weren't happy with, whereas instead it's meant to be just a strategic oversight of the largest schemes.
Yeah, well, I guess it wouldn't have foreseen it sort of one person feeling a bit irked about an application.
Oh, no,
but perhaps
but-
there would be a bar, a petition, if it reaches X
But
amount of
once-
signatures.
Can
then
I-
they
can
might
I-
be
that
able to
process
put
of
in.
a petition, you could have, people would probably regularly be able to meet that bar.
We're running a bit out of time.
Okay, I'll just finish on my
Right,
last
thank you.
follow-up on this point then. I totally agree. I think it's really important to put planning reform in the wider context. I mean, I more often than not huff and gruff at national policy in terms of the viability assessment, making it impossible to deliver affordable housing in the way that we would want to if it wasn't for national policy, planning policy. So if, for instance, on principle you agreed that perhaps being able to ascertain future harms to gentrification was a good way of assessing whether we do pass planning applications or not, London, local or national, would that be something you'd be willing to submit to national government, given that we are expecting planning reforms at some point as a submission?
I think I'd need to look at it in the round. I think it's hard to comment on the hoof, I think.
Thank you.
It's by all means, I think it's something that committee should recommend, and then we can take a look at it in a more kind of measured way rather than on the hoof.
That'd be great. We'll follow up on
Thank
that.
you.
Thank you, Jules.
Before we go on to Assembly Member Best, we're going to, question 14, as laid out on our suggested questions, we're going to have written. Assembly Member Best, please.
Thank you, Chair. Question, I suppose, to whoever wants to take it. Should substantial amendments be made to applications following call-in, given that often amendments lead to an application that does not resemble the original?
I mean, there are limits to what one can do. It cannot be a wholly different application. If it was wholly different, then it would be open to legal challenge if it was. Inevitably, there are changes proposed, and usually, invariably, under this mayor, those changes have been about the amount of affordable housing, and whether it's acceptable to allow potentially luxurious homes on the banks of the Thames through with 12% affordable housing. And the mayor has generally taken things over on that basis to explore if more affordable housing can be extracted from the scheme. As I have said to this committee and elsewhere, often those schemes are expected to do an awful lot in terms of infrastructure, transport, schools, additional school places, as well as affordable housing and much more besides. And therefore, developers propose in return that schemes are altered to be able to achieve that additional affordable housing. And then it's the planning process to decide whether, on balance, the changes are acceptable and are mitigated by the increase in affordable housing.
I mean, something I found interesting in the answer is you say it's inevitable there'll be changes, but under the previous mayor, there was only ever one application that did change after it was called in. So I don't think it's necessarily inevitable that these plans have to change when they're called in. And we know what this often leads to. It means multiple stories being added. And the feeling, again, that this is, a decision being made by an opaque body without many local roots that perhaps don't understand the significant sensitivities of a site, adding stories on without much care. And that's certainly what came through and what we heard from community groups. So I would question, that it is inevitable that they will change, because I think there's something in there for local groups to see that consistency of the same application going through. But I'd also ask, what is that limit? Where do you think there's too many changes here?
Well, firstly, I think if one's going to compare the previous mayor with this mayor, then you've probably got to go into a fair bit of detail about numbers and why they were called in and what was achieved and what wasn't achieved. I think under this mayor there's been 24 call-ins. 21 of them have been decided. I think there were about 17 or so under the previous mayor, but there have been more strategic applications before this mayor. So actually, percentage-wise, the call-ins have been the same at about 3.5%.
To clarify, we're not talking about the amount of call-ins, just the level that have been amended.
And then when you look at I'm talking all about the whole proportionate approach taken on, and then you have to look at the priorities of those mayors. The 17 that were taken over by the previous mayor, I believe, again, I haven't done the research myself, but I believe they were mainly about tall buildings. And so I'm only guessing that those were tall buildings that were turned down by local communities that then that mayor pushed through. I would imagine that local people would feel that that was far more of an intervention and change than some of the changes that this mayor has made. And then when you look at what the difference between what the previous mayor and this mayor was trying to achieve, that mayor, as I say, probably about pushing through tall buildings that had been rejected by local people. This mayor, maybe the same charge could be levelled about tall buildings, but this mayor has achieved a massive increase in the amount of affordable housing from those. So if we compare, one mayor pushes tall buildings through, no increase in affordable housing. This mayor approves, yes, some tall buildings, or taller buildings than they were at Planning, but with a massive increase in affordable housing.
I mean, I find it mad that the suggestion was there perhaps that this mayor hasn't been calling in tall buildings. 19 of those applications have been tall buildings, and like I say, very often what's happened is there's been stories put on. But Jules, that wasn't the question. The question was, where are the limits in amending these applications? Because yes, I understand what you're saying about affordable housing, but you also have to respect the area and the community that's there, because there's no point building what are essentially units if you are destructing communities in doing so. You have to respect the local area, the character, the local infrastructure. And if we're adding stories without any kind of limit on where you stop and say, actually, this application needs to be refused and come back in a different form, that's quite worrying. So I'm asking, where's that limit that you think, we should stop on this amendment now, and this needs to be a new application?
Could you answer quite quickly?
Yeah, I think probably Lucinda's best place to.
I mean, there will be a judgment call
because it's an official judgment call as to whether it's a different scheme or not.
Where it is, if it is a substantially different development and it would be prejudicial to an individual or organisation's interests, so the kind of key parameters, that is a judgment. I mean, many of the schemes that are being called in, there have been improvements in them without any additional height. You've got Hale Wharf went from 30 to 35%. You've got NIMR up in Barnet went from about 17% affordable housing to 35%. You also get reduced car parking. There's all sorts of amendments that are positive in terms of delivering sustainable development within this. You get improvements to tenure mix. It is on a case-by-case basis. Where there are kind of any kind of significant amendments, there would be reconsultation with local communities and engagement to ensure that people have an opportunity to respond to those particular proposals as well.
I'm so aware of time, so I will press on whichever. I just can't simply let that go, because that's a fundamental difference there. As you say, there's been an improvement by reducing car parking. You simply cannot comment and say that's always a good thing, because you don't know that local area and you don't know the effect. Sometimes that has a massive effect on whether accessible housing actually is accessible. So I just out of hand. And again, this old adage: there's no such thing as car-free development. It's just car parking-free development. So there's also a massive effect on the local community. So the very fact that you say that's an improvement, actually, many communities would find that destructive.
In some cases, and in the cases I'm talking about, it was.
I'm looking through the spreadsheet here. It's completely untrue to say that to characterise it as they were all made higher. About half of them haven't been.
I didn't say all have been made higher.
I
said many have been
that the
higher.
majority had there.
I said many have been higher, but that was about the car parking.
Yeah, on the car parking, I mean, as a city, in terms of net zero ambitions, in terms of community severance, in terms of congestion, in terms of air quality, we have to reduce car dependency. That is, I mean, it's tragedy of the commons. What might make sense at the individual level kind of doesn't. I am not saying in every case that you remove car parking, you examine it on a contextual basis. There is clear policy in the London plan to try to deliver against the kind of objectives we have as a city. We assess that on a case-by-case basis. It was to reduce car parking, not to remove it. And blue badge parking and accessible car parking is a separate issue. Even with car-free, there are blue badge kind of spaces. But I think it's a different kind of, I mean, there are nuances clearly within it and different opinions, but in some of the cases, I would argue that a reduction in car parking from very significant kind of car-dependent kind of developments is an improvement in terms of environment and kind of and quality of the city we live in.
Yeah, and I would argue it's destructive for the community that the GLA knows little about. But so the next question that I would ask is, Jules previously told the committee after a 2019 meeting, I believe, that you would ask GLA officers to explore how stage 2 reports can be amended to be less opaque and legalistic. Can you advise on progress made with this?
No, but do we feel that they have been made less legalistic and...
Can we take that one away?
I can't seem to turn this on. We have reviewed them. It is constantly kind of under review in terms of how we organise them, how we structure them. They are still kind of pretty technical and can be kind of quite dense. We're aware of that. They need to address a lot of issues that are kind of brought up. We can take it away and see if there are further things we can do, but they are quite...
I mean, something I would recommend, I would welcome recommendations on. I mean, as in actual suggestions in the way that they could be improved. I mean, make them simpler to understand isn't necessarily a helpful suggestion, but if there are specifics that could be raised that are practical to implement, we would definitely want to implement them.
I think the committee would certainly like to take on that challenge in any report arising from this to be more specific on that. Is there any changes since that 2019 meeting that you could point to in the reports?
Predates. I can go away and
We have amended our template. I can think of 4 different times since then. I'm scraping my memory because I'd only just joined the GLA at that point, so it's kind of one of the early conversations. We have amended the template. We've shortened the template from what I remember as well. In your suggestions how we improve the report, I ask you just to keep in mind that we do have to fully explain some of the decisions we've reached. Otherwise, the decision is open to challenge at judicial review, and far more open to challenge the kind of the shorter it gets. So we've just got to be a bit careful there. But yeah, very much open to taking on board any recommendations.
Perfect.
Yeah, and I would just add to that making it legally unchallengeable does lead to the use of some unhelpful language.
I was just wondering, we're running up against the time very
Well, hopefully,
much.
if the answer to this next question is yes, that should be super quick. It's does the GLA have specialist conservation or heritage officers to advise the mayor on planning applications?
currently we don't. I have just taken through a request through the various kind of processes that are required to get extra headcount. So we will be going out to recruit a heritage officer very shortly. The last form has just been signed off, so the recruitment will be starting.
It's pretty close to a yes, isn't it? So it's good. Thanks.
Assembly Member Berry, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, just to note, while we're in the meeting, that I do have a specific idea for how to make reports clearer in terms of the decision-making and the weight given to different factors. And I will feed that to you, I think, as part of our work.
Happy to do that. We're going to be writing lots. Assembly Member Baker, I'm sorry for the delay coming.
No, thank you. So I've got 2 questions at the end of this session. I'll try and keep them quick, and I think we'll ask you to keep the answers quick if possible as well. The first is, we heard a lot from community groups at the session about concerns around the social impact of major developments, so changing the makeup of the cultural nature of an area, the demographics, and everything like that. This is obviously related to the considerations of gentrification as well. Are there places during the process at the moment where it's possible to give consideration to the social impact of major developments, and are you able to take advice from specialists on this? Oh, this looks like it's going to be a big answer.
Yes, it's a complex answer because obviously social aspects are considered. They're at the heart of many of the things that one considers on large applications. You know, an example being the social infrastructure required for a proposal and whether it meets the needs of the future makeup of the area. At the other end of the spectrum, though, which I think maybe you were getting to, it brings back to Assemblymember Shake's point about gentrification and whether one can measure social impacts and predict social impacts in advance.
So I suppose the question is not what you're doing in terms to serve what the future might be, but are there any places that you feel in the current process that impact is currently able to be taken into account?
The impact on current residents?
Yes. The social impact of a development on the current.
I mean, yes, certainly on for example, estate regeneration, and the mayor's principles for estate regeneration absolutely take that into consideration. And probably the need, you know, the employment of those by the mayor probably does indicate that perhaps it isn't currently in the planning system, but the mayor's good practice guide that he insists on boroughs following, and you know, the different bits have to be, different requirements have to be met as part of the mayor's decision making, do actively look at the impact on residents and the ability to return to the estate, and whether leaseholders have been treated fairly, and so on. Yeah. And looks for obviously an increase in the amount of affordable housing than was there previously.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll probably leave that one.
So aspects of it do, but
yeah,
in a very broad, formulaic, comprehensive way in terms of kind of social justice and future equalities impacts. The planning system doesn't do that.
Yeah.
Oh, Peter.
And this, so I'm going to sound like a really broken record, I'm really sorry, but in order for that to be really effective, it needs to be in the planning policy. So once again,
yeah,
to get, this is why it's so important that we spend time engaging communities in development of what they think the future of their community looks
yeah,
like. And that's probably a better way of saying in the planning policy.
Yeah, no, that's fine. It's
Yeah.
just that it was just wondering whether at the moment you felt that it was being addressed at any point, or whether that's something that we can take away. And my second question is, community groups have told us that the public sector equalities duty should be considered during the process. And what reassurance can you give community groups on this?
I'm tempted to refer you back to the answer I gave previously, that not comprehensively. I mean, obviously, we observe our equalities duties in the way we go about the process, but they are not measurements within the process.
Thank you very much. I thank you to all our panellists today. Thank you very much for your answers. As you know, we will be returning to this very, very frequently. It's as a major investigation for this committee. But thank you very much, and you're free to go. Can I now say that we're going to have a very quick adjournment to switch over, a couple of minutes? Yeah, and we'll be back for 3:36 in a bit. Thank you. Can I now welcome our guests for the next part of the meeting? First of all, joining remotely is Councillor Jonathan Cardy, who's the chair of the Planning Committee for the London Borough of Richmond, and we can see him there on the monitor. And here with us today are Councillor Eva Greenspan, who's chair of the Strategic Planning Committee for the London Borough of Barnet, welcome, and Councillor Kath Whittam, who's chair of the Planning Subcommittee at the London Borough of Southwark, welcome. I'm going to launch with the first questions, couple of questions, if I may. Do you have concerns about the Mayor or Deputy Mayor of London being the sole decision maker on applications that have been called in? Perhaps I could, oh yes, Councillor Greenspan.
I take that? Yes, please. Yeah, I mean, I'm 32 years now on Barnet Council. I'm a councillor representing my ward. And 50 years I lived in the borough now. And I have great concern because we are threatened all the time that the mayor may call in these applications and decide. And mostly what he called in decided on more high rise and density, and it doesn't blend into the area. The residents are all upset. It gets a big upset in the area, and it just doesn't fit in. It is changing the whole landscape. Plus, he is now threatening, or he is considering, to build over station car parks. And this is very, very difficult and dangerous in many aspects, because the streets next to, particularly the car park in my ward, the station car park, are Victorian houses without garages, without frontage parking, and the parking will be a chaos. Also, women at night, they can be stabbed going out of the station looking for their car. It is security, it is dangerous, and it's actually spoiling the whole landscape. He's really doing these high-rise developments, and I'm trying to get them down in the local plan, that we have a limit. I don't know how to overrule this mayor, but he is so keen on doing this sort of thing without going. I mean, it was very healthy what you said, that you would have an officer coming to the area and actually negotiate or looking at the area before you decide. Because you can just not call in and just do something and spoil the whole environment. It is absolutely unacceptable.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, Councillor Cardy, you wanted to come in.
Thank you, Chair. The difference to my mind between one individual making a planning decision and a planning committee of 9 is that I've spoken to people who lost at planning, but came away saying, well, we lost, but we lost 5-3, or in one case, we lost 7-1, but at least we got the chair of planning to vote with us. And when you have one individual, you don't get that, whether you think it's a consolation prize or and yes, very often we wind up with unanimous decisions on our planning committee, but at least then it's usually because people have not made a valid case under planning policy. So I think that's one big advantage of having a panel of people making a decision rather than an individual. And another advantage is that there are always going to be occasions when, as an individual, you recognise a distant relative sitting on the among the objectors or something, and as a member, as one of 9 members of the committee, you leave the room for that item. It's a much more difficult process when you've got one individual, but presumably there will be occasions when that individual winds up saying, well, I just realised that my niece or whatever is now moved into that block of flats, and therefore I can't sit on this application.
Thank you. Councillor Whittam.
Yes, I'd echo what Councillor Cardy said. I too have reservations about one person making a decision. You don't however much you try, you do bring your personal prejudices towards certain applications. And if there's just one person making the decision, then you have all their baggage with them. Whereas if there are 7, 8, 9 of you, then you listen to everybody's point of view before you make your decision.
Do you think perhaps that the final decision on planning permissions that the mayor has called in, we're just focused on those, should be made by a wider group of people rather than just the mayor?
The one I was most concerned about that was called in was the biscuit factory in Bermondsey. It was recommended for refusal by our officers. The committee recommended it for refusal, but the mayor passed it. And I found that very difficult to swallow, because it's overturning not only the committee's decision, but the officers who've got all the planning know-how behind them, and the legal officers and everybody else, and just one person was making that decision.
Councillor Cardy, you've indicated.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I can understand that we're 32 boroughs and the mayor has an overall thing. If it's a case of this is an application on a borough boundary and people in the other borough are saying, well, this has various detrimental effects, can the mayor handle it rather than as there's a dispute between the two? We have in Richmond a whole lot of areas that get flooded before hopefully anyone gets flooded downstream. And if somebody were to apply to build on Petersham Meadows that wasn't available to be flooded in areas of heavy rain, I would hope that the mayor would be able to call that in and say, well, this has clear effects on a whole bunch of other places in London. I'm less certain about why the mayor needs to be pulling in applications where, frankly, there isn't much an effect beyond the borough boundary. And particularly ones where I'm thinking of Stag Brewery, for example, where we really needed a secondary school that was going to come in on that location, and only a tiny fraction of the pupils for that school would come from that small development, but, well, small compared to the size of a secondary school. But we really needed that secondary school, and the process of the mayor calling the thing in, the sheer time involved in that delay, aside from anything else, causes some difficulty because the kids are getting to that age.
We know that some called-in applications, amendments are made to them by the mayor. Do you think that local residents and community groups should be given a greater role in deciding those amendments? Who wants to? Assembly member. Oh, sorry, Councillor Greenspan.
I think they should do, because they know the area, they live in the area. And I think we as local councillors and the community group should have a say in the decision. It shouldn't be just the mayor.
Thank you.
He doesn't live in the area, he doesn't know the area.
And Councillor Cardy, what's your view on this?
The mayor has certain tools that are not available to us mere borough councillors. The mayor controls Transport for London. So where we get a large application, an application involves large numbers of new people moving into an area, the mayor has the tools to turn around and say, I will improve the transport facility in this area to enable it to handle several hundred extra homes. We can lobby Transport for London and so on, but we don't have that tool. So I can see the mayor having a role there. As far as community groups and etc., I would hope that they would see the council planning process as something where they can get involved in, and it's very difficult to see how a London level thing, unless you had a council that wasn't allowing members of the public to speak at planning committee and so on, which I gather we have at least one London Borough that still is in that 19th century mindset. But if you've got a council that is enabling the public to lobby and speak to planning committees, etc., then no, I see the role of the mayor as say having tools such as controlling TfL.
Thank you. Assembly Member, Councillor Greenspan. I keep demoting you. I'm so sorry. Councillor Greenspan.
I have devised some questions which I think have to be asked before you decide on anything. Oh, sorry. Before you decide on anything. First of all, does it look right in the borough or in the area concerned? Does this look safe for the area? Will it spoil the landscape, and is it reasonable?
Councillor Whittam.
Sorry, am I on? I agree with Councillor Cardy that I would hope that ward councillors would know the local groups within that area that are affected by the development and would be advocating for them as well. So I don't see that there's a need for extra representation for those people because they have their representations in their local councillors.
Do you think the process behind the amendments, do you think they're transparent enough? I don't know if you've had any in Southwark that have been amended on being called in.
Well, with the biscuit factory, Grosvenor were proposing 0 social rented homes. The mayor got them up to 140 out of 1,500. So still way below policy. But then you think, is that the best we can do? If it goes to the Secretary of State, would that be a worse option? So although I was gutted that it was passed, we had to take it.
Yeah. Were you made familiar with the amendments that were being proposed?
No,
right.
Not really.
Okay.
We were just told the outcome.
Okay. I'm now going to ask. Oh, Councillor Cardy, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong screen. I do apologise if I keep missing you. Sorry.
Not a problem. I've chaired hybrid meetings myself as well. I know the difficulties. I just wanted to add a little point which reinforcing something that was raised by one of your members half an hour ago. The viability test is the thing that's really stuffing us when it comes to affordable housing, and I think the mayor is under the same difficulties as we are. We really need that viability test to be scrapped, frankly, and that's the solution to getting affordable housing on these developments. Going higher and higher does mean you can put more affordable housing into schemes, and I can see that's why the mayor goes higher. But unless you combine that with some sort of additional transport investments, etc., you're just creating slums in the sky. That's the risk.
Councillor Whittam.
Yeah, we view viability assessments as smoke and mirrors, because you can make a viability assessment, say whatever you want it to say. So we basically have instructed our officers that if it doesn't meet 35% social affordable housing, it doesn't get to committee, and they send it away until they come back with 35%.
Okay, thank you. I'd now like to hand over to Assembly Member Berry to ask the next question.
Thank you very much. Just to clarify on what you were just saying about the fact that you didn't hear, I think particularly Councillor Whittam, you said on the biscuit factory you weren't kept informed about the process of negotiations. Is that have you tried to get involved, and have you been rebuffed on a sort of legalistic basis? If they said, like, this is nothing to do with you anymore, I've taken it out of your hands. Is this something we could ask for improvements on, or are we again fighting against the law if we try and make changes?
I think that comms in general can be very much improved, because you tend to hear just on the grapevine, oh, the biscuit factory's been called in, you know, and you don't hear any of the workings of the process at all. So I think the GLA could keep us better informed.
Even if they're not consulting you because they don't have to. Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Well, I mean, it isn't our process. Once it is with the mayor, it is with the mayor. And we can make representations, and we do make representations, but you become a consumer rather than a provider at that point.
There you go. I should move on to my real question. So the other thing that happens with a lot of planning applications is when it's being decided at a local level, particularly major planning applications, there's a lot of people get involved with them because they're concerned about the process of construction more than the change from before and after. Like, cause things can take years and years and years, and people are very, very concerned about the construction management process. Now, this isn't a planning decision matter, but it is part of the planning process to come up with relevant conditions, things that, if a local authority is doing it, depend quite a lot on local knowledge and what the conditions might be for the transport and the dealing with dust and the nearby things that might be affected by noise and air quality. When this gets called up to the mayor, and I've written to the Deputy Mayor, Jules Piper, we've had in about this before, he's replied very clearly to say that, you know, when the GLA is the planning authority, it is the one who does the planning conditions at that point, and they say that they work very closely with the local authorities on that, and there may even be draft conditions if this has been gone to a certain stage with the local authority. So I wanted to ask the councils who are here, is that the case? Are you finding that when something, you've all experienced things being called in, are you finding that the process of getting the conditions right and the construction management plan, all those things that come through Section 106, is that working for you, or do you feel shut out of that as well? Because I'm dealing with a number of residents who are affected by things that have been called in, and they don't feel the planning conditions were right. They also feel that enforcement isn't brilliant either, but that is a separate matter entirely. So who would like to go first?
I'm happy to go first.
Okay.
I think we are very good at putting conditions on planning applications when it's our own ones, but whether if it's been called in, I would hope that they would carry over the draft conditions from the local authority.
I quite agree with Councillor Whittam.
In cases where there aren't draft conditions, because the local authority is intending to refuse, though, how is that process managed?
Our officers are always prepared with draft conditions.
Love it. Excellent.
I see Councillor Carby
Yes,
has indicated.
please come in.
Thank you. I'd echo my lady from Southwark. Our officers, if they think there's any risk of an overturn, they usually have some draft conditions up their sleeve. However, there can be some very, very specific things that ward councillors can wind up raising, such as don't have any heavy goods vehicle movements on this site if you're within the week of the Hampton Court Flower Show. Now, there is a small part of the borough where that would apply, and I wouldn't expect the mayor, I wouldn't expect anyone from outside the Hamptons to think of that particular condition and how far that's needed from particular sites. So there is an element of localism that can be useful in this, even if it's a very large site and it's on the borough boundary. And my sample set of this is two planning applications being called in the nearly 4 years I've been chair, and I don't think I've seen enough of that to really give a judgment on how effective the mayor is at picking up conditions on there.
That is a really good point. I mean, as a borough councillor myself, I'm used to feeding in sensible suggestions for conditions and construction management in my area on much smaller applications. I've never had a major one. And would it be the borough's job to make sure that local ward councillors are involved in the way you've suggested, or would it be something that the mayor might be expected to do?
I think if the mayor is actually making himself the decision maker, he really needs to pull in not just assembly members who cover a huge chunk of London, but ward councillors who have a very in-depth knowledge of their own particular ward.
Thank you very much. I'm not a constituency assembly member, so I've no idea whether constituency assembly members ever get asked about major planning applications in their area. We might need to canvass you all. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last set question is from Assembly Member Sheikh.
Yeah, thank you to the panel for joining us. I'm not sure how much of the first part of the meeting you caught, but in November we had community groups and London-wide experts come to speak to us about how we can continue to improve community engagement. One of the key kind of aspirations for this mayor in terms of ensuring that the planning application process can be accessible, how we build in London can be shaped by what people in London want. So I wanted to ask if there's best practice that we can continue to develop locally that you can give an example of.
Assembly Member. Councillor Whittam, so I'm sorry the demotion.
It's been a long day.
I would point to Canada Water Development. We have a master plan there, and the statement of community involvement is extremely specific, and the development consultation charter is being followed. And I can't praise British Land enough for their diligence in contacting people. I'm fed up with them contacting me because they do it so often and ask my opinion on, and do I want to walk round every few weeks? Just get on and build it, you know. So you would do worse than speak to British Land about their consultation process.
Thank you, Councillor. And did you have your hand up, or Councillor?
I think that that local residents and councillors should be involved, definitely, because the mayor is an outside body who comes into the ward, into the borough, into this area, and he doesn't really understand or knows. I mean, he can't understand. It's not a fault, but you can't understand every area in London. And he comes into the area and he doesn't understand what's happening. The local residents and the officers and the councillors know what is going to happen, and they need it explained. I mean, the mayor needs it explained to him what will happen if he goes ahead with whatever he suggests or proposes, that it's unacceptable in many areas, yeah.
And do you have best practice locally that you would sort of share with the committee? So
yes.
What does that look like?
You mean
examples of community engagement that have been successfully locally that you might want to share with the GLA?
Yes, we have local groups who get very involved in the Finchley Society and this society and that. They get very involved in planning applications. But besides that point, the officers know the area. They recommend something. The mayor comes and overrules it. But it's not only this. The local residents are helpless. They're there and they don't know what to do.
And the councillor online, I didn't catch the surname.
Councillor Cardy.
Carly, did you have, is that
Thank you.
a legacy hand or a hand for this question?
It's a new hand. So one of the things that we sometimes do in Richmond is we appoint a liaison committee, sometimes chaired by a local councillor, sometimes not, of local residents and people otherwise affected by site, and that's a liaison committee for the developer during the development phase, to deal with things like getting the right route in, or making sure there are sufficient banksmen on to navigate lorries through particular narrow streets. And I've been involved in 2 or 3 of those being set up for developments during the last couple of years. I have to admit, I haven't heard much feedback on how those are going or not, but it is something we do.
Okay, well, perhaps the committee can have a follow-up from you if that's possible on how those are doing. I mean, I think what was helpful to have from the Deputy Mayor is being able to share some of the examples that community groups had in November of how they would like to see the sort of process continue developing. And it was good, yeah, to hear some sort of forthcoming desires to adapt and how can I say this, evolve these processes. So I think there'll certainly be more work that the committee will be following up on. And yeah, thank you for coming to join us.
There's another thing which could be done, I think, and people mentioned earlier on when I was listening, the Stag Brewery and site tours of that large site, most of which has not been publicly accessible for a very long period, if ever. One of the reasons why that was useful was that we saw and had explained to us, this is the thick solid wall that's for keeping the river out on if it's flooding, and this is the much thinner wall above it which would stop people climbing over and nicking crates of beer from the brewery, and where on that wall the new ground level would be under the particular planning application, and which particular features or which particular listed buildings would still be around in the development, which they wouldn't. Now, you could do some of that with a video tour on there, which would clarify some of the stuff which isn't publicly accessible, without the difficulties of supervising a group of people on what is effectively a building site with all the risks and so on of poorly maintained buildings, etc. We didn't do a video from that, but I think if we were doing something similar in future, it might be something I would suggest. But I can understand why people wouldn't want to have large numbers of people traipsing around a site like that.
Yeah, no, I think there's been a lot of learnings actually from the Stag Brewery application. It was spoken at quite a lot of length at the last meeting. I mean, on that particular one, obviously the Mayor did invite community groups to come and speak at length, more than what they're sort of legally allowed to do based on how the process is outlined. So I think, just to come back to some of the points you've made, Councillor Greenspan, I think the Mayor's process is to engage communities, to have them come and present and to listen to them so that he does get that local context, which is not specific to any mayor, it's part of the process. And I think Councillor Whittam, you had your hand up, so just to come back to you with the biscuit factory, I think there was an improvement in the amount of affordable housing that was sort of secured after the Mayor had called it in. It went from 27% to 35%. So I think the aspiration with each Mayor is to sort of implement their London-wide priorities. I think that's their remit, and affordable housing being this particular Mayor's kind of priority. So I think what's clear is more communication is needed to communicate that, and at every stage, and involve ward councillors. But did you want to come back in on?
I just wanted to say we have resident project groups as well, and they work very well, and they bring up problems as they arise so that they can be addressed by the developer. We also have one project group which is looking at number 2 Ann Moss Way in Rotherhithe, which is my ward. And that's going to be a zero carbon building, and we've got the whole of Ann Moss Way involved in the design of that. So that hasn't gone to planning committee yet, but it's been very interesting looking at retrofitting the
Absolutely.
existing building versus knocking down a building again, and ground source heat pumps, things like that.
Dare I say a site visit coming on for the committee? That sounds, yeah, that sounds fantastic. Thank you for sharing that.
Assembly Member Best.
Thank you, Chair. I think, firstly, I really wanted to just ask if we could get Deputy Mayor Jules Pipe back in here for Councillor Cardy's first assessment, which sums up the point I was trying to make earlier about how residents feel going to a committee meeting in comparison to having that one decision by the Mayor. And yes, the outcome may, in both respects, be negative, but, you know, just having that opportunity to be questioned by a number of members or garner the support of just one person really does make a difference. But the question I had for the committee was, you're all experienced councillors, you've been in the roles for a long time. Have you noticed a shift in the way things are running at all? Are you noticing that you're getting more call-ins? Are you feeling there's less communication? Or do you think this has always been something that's been at arm's length, how the GLA runs and overtakes applications?
I must say it hasn't improved. It's been getting worse and worse. I mean, for instance, this threat about building over car parks is just horrendous, because where these poor people are going to go who park their car there, only in the side streets, they be saturated. And what do you do when you're at night coming out, or people with children, with buggies, with whatever? I mean, it is unacceptable what's happening. Actually, one developer already withdrew not to build, so thank God for that.
Thank you. Councillor Cardy.
Thank you, Chair. While I'm in my 5th term as a councillor, I haven't been on the planning committee for more than about a quarter of that time, so I'm not sure I can answer that particular thing as to. But as far as I'm aware, certainly from my own ward, the GLA call-in has been a relatively rare thing. Where I am concerned is that I think it could be better focused on borough boundary issues and maybe even give boroughs the right to call in a neighbouring one. And yeah, there is this issue of trying to get affordable housing, but I might follow up with Southwark on that.
Thank you. And oh, I beg your pardon. Oh, I'm so sorry, Councillor Whitton.
You may be aware that the new Southwark plan is going to Council Assembly in February. So we've really tightened up a lot of our policies. So the developers, I think, are quite happy about that. That it's not so woolly, and they're not trying to push through things that they now know won't get through our committee. It's funny because different members of the committee have different bits that they go on about all the time. So one member goes on about cycle parking, I go on about play space. Another member goes on about carbon emissions. But we've tightened up all those policies. So if they don't meet the policy, then they can expect a refusal. And I think that's lessened our call-ins, because once they know the rules, they will play by the rules.
Thank you very much. You've spent a lot of time with us, and I'm just going to indulge you with, if I can, with just one more question. We've talked a lot about the outcome of the call-in process, and Councillor Cardy referred to why he thought the call-ins, where the circumstances where he thought call-ins were a reasonable thing. But are there, would you say that there, would you like to see any changes in the criteria for calling in? Is that something that you've exercised your minds about how the call-in process, actually the criteria, might be changed? Councillor Cardy, please.
One of the items you've got on there is 150 homes. Now, 150 homes, if we're talking a high density single bedroom units, is a much smaller piece of land that it might necessarily be on than if we were talking about 155 bedroom houses. I think measuring it by number of homes, one gives an incentive for developers to go in a particular direction, and it kind of misses the point whether you do it by square meters of land or square meters of residential. If somebody, I appreciate there's legislation behind it, but if you were going to do something based on the size of the development, then I wouldn't measure it by number of front doors. And I do think that having some sort of process whereby the mayor is there to knock heads to arbitrate where more than one borough is at odds of something that affects more than one borough, that's useful. And where it's a case of if we're going to do this amount of additional housing, we really need Transport for London to get involved and up the capacity of particular elements of transport. And I can see a role for the mayor being involved, but not necessarily as the planning partner, more as the transport partner, saying, if you do this, this is what we will do in order to increase the capacity and make this possible.
Thank you. Councillor Greenspan.
Every application has to be seen at its own merit. We can't sort of judge on the square footage or the size of it. We have to see in the area and how it fits and how it goes. And I think the mayor, before he calls in, he should have a team of people to look at and also engage with the local authority before he calls it in.
Thank you. Councillor Whittam.
I find it difficult because I take this job very seriously, and so do my co-councillors. The officers are very professional, and if we've come to a decision, I find it difficult that decision is not honoured, because, well, I don't think we come to any decisions that are not for sound planning reasons, for example, which is one of the criteria. If we were doing it because just say, oh, I don't like it, then that's fair enough, call it in. But we have agonised over much of these applications. We have briefings upon briefings, and we ask questions and we get them to change things before it comes to committee. And I find it difficult that somebody can just whip that out of our hands and then take over the whole thing.
Thank you so much. Your testimony today has been extremely important to us. And I'm really very grateful for you coming in and joining us remotely to with us, try and improve the planning processes for call-ins. And it just goes to show that, you know, we are here for you as Planning and Regeneration Committee for the London Assembly, and you'll always be welcome. And if there's anything that occurs to you that you feel you may not have mentioned, please do write, and we will take that all into account. So thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time. Thank you. Can we note the report and today's discussion?
Noted.
Can we also delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any output from this discussion?
Agreed.
Can we note, you're free to go instantly, well, you know this bit, you know. So can we note the committee's work programme and additional activity undertaken since our last meeting? The informal briefings from the GLA planning team on public engagement with mayoral planning decisions and the Planning London Data Hub, and the informal session with the CPRE Countryside Charity. Is that noted?
Noted.
The date of the next meeting is scheduled for the 8th of February 2022 at 10 a.m. I've had no urgent business notified to me, so I'll bring the meeting to a close. Thank you all so much. Thank you.